the Houston Texans were on the bottom at the end of last year. Hell yeah. What a transition. Because their offensive line was crap. It was awful. 8 sacks allowed against the Chiefs in that divisional playoff loss. 8 sacks? Good googly boogly. I don't care how long CJ Stroud might have been holding it. That was a reflection of an offensive line that had bad coaching from Chris Strausser, had an offensive coordinator in Bobby Slowick who was sus at best, with a lot of players in the offensive side of things questioning him at times during last season, even though he stuck around for the entirety of the year. And an offensive line that featured a lot of early round draft pick investments struggling, with Laramie Tunsil, the best offensive lineman of all of them, and now he is gone. He has been traded to the Washington Commanders. So, with Tunsil not having a good year, but being the Texans' best offensive lineman, with Kenyon Green, a former first-round pick, being a bust, he's now in Philadelphia. With Juice Scruggs, not looking like a second-round pick to this point. With Shaq Mason being awful to the point where the Texans just cut him this offseason. And at right tackle, Titus Howard, who agreed to a contract restructure. We don't know what he is, but he's definitely not a right tackle anymore. This offensive line stunk. And then we saw that article that came out about how the Texans had a toxic offensive line room per Albert Breer. We discussed it. I do think it stands to reason that Breer was hearing this from people closer to the situation, did not see Breer very often in the Houston Texans locker room after games. I do have a hunch as to who Breer heard this from. I don't necessarily disagree with the Texans offensive line room not being where it needed to be last year. I don't disagree with that. Toxic is a strong way to describe it. I think that the toxicity might have been more about the coaching dynamics, the disagreements between offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick and now assistant offensive line coach last year, Cole Popovich, who also might have not seen eye to eye with Chris Strausser, who may have had one leg out the door thinking about retirement last season. Like, I think that might have lent itself to the Texans locker room being reported as toxic. But here's what DeMeco Ryans had to say at the NFL league meetings when asked by Aaron Wilson of Channel 2 about that offensive line room being toxic.
I think our guys in that room, they competed, they battled. It didn't always go how we wanted it to go, but there was nothing toxic in the room. Those guys showed up to work every day. Those guys were a tight group. They went out to dinners throughout the week. So I don't know where their report came from, but it's very incorrect. That's nothing in our building. That's nothing I stand for. As the head coach of the team, we bring in the right people. We bring in good guys, and all those guys are great guys.
I don't know where that report came from, but it's very incorrect. In case you couldn't hear the audio, a lot of wind in the background on this golf course. Very incorrect. It is totally possible that what Breer wrote and what he heard would make one say this locker room, this offensive line group doesn't have it. And that, in the eyes of some, especially if you're talking about, hey, what's holding this potential Super Bowl contender back? When a locker room, and specifically the offensive line side of things, seems dead after a victory, or when they are perplexed and taken aback by the amount of backlash they got after they came against the Vikings, I can understand how on the outside looking in, you can say, well, this group is a problem. And take a jump from problem to toxic. It's not that far. I mean, if something's toxic, it's the part of a team that's bringing it down, right? So the actual reporting there and that word, it's one of those buzzwords that certainly gets a lot of attention, but I don't buy DeMeco's pushback. I don't. It was an issue last year. They weren't playing well, and I didn't really feel like they had the care to fix problems as quickly as they needed to. I think that they really bought into their press clippings going into the year. Laramie Tunsil's one of those guys who is constantly thinking about where he ranks among tackles, and clearly he had earned a lot of respect in that Texans offensive line room. If this guy's kind of about himself, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, he's focused on himself and he constantly plays well. If that guy's focused on himself and the rest of the locker room perhaps isn't being focused on by the vet, what happens? When you got an offensive line coach who has retired and may have had one foot out all season long last year, what happens? Well, you got an offensive coordinator that doesn't seem to know what he's doing. And then you got an offensive line group that's trying to follow what he's preaching and is having a difficult time doing it. What happens? All of that stuff can lend to being toxic compared to the rest of the Houston Texans. So, DeMeco Ryans, who said the characterization of the Texans' offensive line room was toxic, is, quote, very incorrect, end quote. I don't know that I buy that. Even if DeMeco Ryans is specifically talking about the players here, and I do think that the idea of a toxic locker room was more about the coaches than it was about the players. What was the unit on this team that struggled? It was the offensive line. There's a lot of turnover this offseason. So DeMeco is clearly aware of that, as is Nick Caserio. You can call a group that is the worst part of a team toxic, even if it's not a bunch of bitchy mean girls from the movie Mean Girls, the plastics, if you will, that are being a bunch of a-holes to the rest of the team. Like, it doesn't have to be that to actually be toxic to the rest of the team. I know we're now debating the idea of the word toxic, but DeMeco pushing back on this, I'm sorry, I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I mean that is the thing, is that I think it's the word that Breer chose that has given these guys the wiggle room to push back on, like, no, these guys all got along. It's like, yeah, that's not what we're saying. Like, we're saying the working relationship was toxic. And the coaching dynamic was toxic. And yeah, like you said, toxic has this like connotation now to where it's like a relation. Like, people think about a toxic relationship where it's like real bad stuff is going on. Where it's like, no, this just isn't working, and it's like dragging the team down, as evidence A, by anyone with eyeballs that watched this team last year, and B, by this team who went out and traded away its best left tackle, its best offensive lineman, and changed over 2 guard spots. Like, this team has changed 60% of the starting offensive line from last year, and they're sitting here telling us, like, we loved our group last year. What, we don't bring in bad players. Like, no, you guys do bring in bad players. You did at least 2 from, if we're judging off last year, as the 2 guys starting at guard.
Toxic might be a trigger word if you're DeMeco and you hear it to what you're saying there, Sean. But okay, do you need to push back on it when clearly changes were made this offseason? Can't you just say last year was last year? We're on to this year.
We're disappointed in the performance last year, toxic or not.
Because this is the same gaslighty bullshit. Pardon my language. This is the same gaslighty crap that they were pushing last year. They did this a lot last year. It was so infuriating. Like, telling us about, hey, the offensive line, we like the direction it's going in. This is consistent with that. And hey, look, this is a bandwagony sports town. If you want to get some of the people to buy back in, please just be honest with us. It's not that hard.
Yeah, we're not asking for a Boston Globe style shank job on the way out. Like, we're not asking for the Nico Harrison and Mavs ownership group like trying to explain themselves for 2 weeks about why they traded Luka Doncic. Like, we're not asking you to pull out a shiv on Laramie Tunsil or even Chris Strasser or like anyone, but just be honest with, like, this was a disappointing group. Like, that guys, this was a disappointing group. I don't know about toxic. To me, I didn't think it was toxic, whatever. But there's a reason that we're changing over at least 3 starters from last year's team.
I really think DeMeco, when he hears toxic, he immediately says, I got to push back on this.
Yeah.
But you think about the general meaning of that word. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's a bunch of bad guys.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's what DeMeco heard. When
yeah,
he was
you
asked
think
that
about
question.
like a team that like absolutely is like falling apart at the seams in the locker room. Yeah,
Yeah.
like a team that's just splintering like crazy. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying.
No.